Aye, wailed Legolas. A Balrog is come! Gimli stared with wide eyes. Durin's bane! He cried, and letting his axe fall, he covered his face. The dark figure, streaming with fire, raced towards them. The orcs yelled and poured over the stone gangways. Then Boromir raised his horn and blew. Loud the challenge rang and bellowed, like the shout of many throats under the cavernous roof. For a moment, the orcs quailed, and the fiery shadow halted. Then the echoes died as suddenly as a flame blown out by the dark wind, and the enemy advanced again.
"Over the bridge!"
cried Gandalf, recalling his strength.
"Fly! This is a foe beyond any of you. I must hold the narrow way. Fly!"
Aragorn and Boromir did not heed the command, but still held their ground, side by side behind Gandalf at the far end of the bridge. The others halted just within the doorway at the hall's end, and turned, unable to leave their leader to face the enemy alone. The Balrog reached the bridge. Gandalf stood in the middle of the span, leaning on the staff in his left hand, but in his other hand, Glamdring gleamed, cold and white. His enemy halted again, facing him, and the shadow about it reached out like two vast wings. It raised the whip, and the thongs whined and cracked. Fire came from its nostrils, but Gandalf stood firm.
"You cannot pass."
The orc stood still, and a dead silence fell.
"I am a servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flames of Anor. You cannot pass. The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udun. Go back to the shadow. You cannot pass."
The Balrog made no answer. The fire in it seemed to die, but the darkness grew. It stepped forward slowly onto the bridge, and suddenly it drew itself up to a great height, and its wings were spread from wall to wall. But still, Gandalf could be seen, glimmering in the gloom. He seemed small, and altogether alone, grey and bent, like a wizened tree before the onset of a storm. From out of the shadow, a red sword leaped flaming. Glamdring glimmered white in answer. There was a ringing clash and a stab of white fire. The Balrog fell back, and its sword flew up in molten fragments. The wizard swayed on the bridge, stepped back a pace, and then again stood still.
"You cannot pass!"
he said. With a bound, the Balrog leapt, full upon the bridge. Its whip whirled and hissed.
"He cannot stand alone!"
cried Aragorn suddenly, and ran back along the bridge.
"Elendil!
He shouted.
I am with you, Gandalf! Gondor!"
cried Boromir, and leaped after him. At that moment, Gandalf lifted his staff, and crying aloud, he smote the bridge before him. The staff broke asunder, and fell from his hand. A blinding sheet of white flame sprang up. The bridge cracked. Right at the Balrog's feet, it broke, and the stone upon which it stood crashed into the gulf, while the rest remained, poised, quivering like a tongue of rock, thrust out into emptiness. With a terrible cry, the Balrog fell forward, and its shadow plunged down and vanished. But even as it fell, it swung its whip, and the thongs lashed and curled down the wizard's neck, dragging him into the brink. He staggered and fell, grasped vainly at the stone, and slid into the abyss.
"Fly, you fools!"
he cried, and was gone. The fires went out, and the blank darkness fell. The company stood rooted with horror, staring into the pit. Even as Aragorn and Boromir came flying back, the rest of the bridge cracked and fell. With a cry, Aragorn roused them.
"We must obey his last command. Follow me!"
They stumbled wildly up the great stairs beyond the door, Aragorn leading, Boromir at the rear. At the top was a wide, echoing passage. Along this they fled. Frodo heard Sam at his side, weeping, and then the drum beats rolled behind, mournful now, and slow. Doom. They ran on. The light grew before them. Great shafts pierced the roof. They ran swifter. They passed into a hall, bright with daylight, from its high windows in the east. They fled across it. Through its huge broken doors they passed, and suddenly, before them, the great gates opened, an arc of blazing light. There was a guard of orcs crouching in the shadows behind the great doorpost, towering on the other side. But the gates were shattered and cast down. Aragorn smote to the ground the captain that stood in his path, and the rest fled in terror of his wrath. The company swept past them and took no heed of them. Out of the gates they ran and sprang down the huge and age-worn steps, the threshold of Moriah. Thus, at last, they came beyond hope under the sky, and felt the wind on their faces. They did not halt until they are out of the bowshot from the mountains. Dimrill Dale lay about them, the shadow of the misty mountains lay upon it, but eastwards there was a golden light on the land. It was but 1 hour afternoon. The sun was shining, the clouds were white and high. Dark yawned the archways of the gates under the mountain shadow. Faint and far beneath the earth rolled the slow drumbeats. Doom. A thin black smoke trailed out. Nothing else was to be seen. The dale all around was empty. Doom. Grief at last wholly overcame them, and they wept long, some standing and silent, some cast upon the ground. Doom, doom. The drum beats faded.